Hi everyone, my name is Belkis Choice-Praslin. I'm the instructor for SPED 225X, the exceptional child. This video is for lesson 1, Introduction to Special Education and IDEA. For today's video, we're going to be going over two main buckets to begin with in our series of videos. The first thing we're going to look over is a brief, and I mean brief, history of disability and special education in America. We have some guiding questions to help us along the way. The first being, how have disability rights progressed in the United States? And the second being, what landmark legislative cases have helped move the field of special education forward? The next area we're going to look into is introduction to IDEA and special education disability categories within IDEA. So some questions for that area are, what is IDEA? Why do we need it? And who are our students with disabilities? So we'll start with big picture history of disability education. And this is my interpretation of the big picture history. Obviously, many more things happen, but just long-term eagle eye view, when we're looking at, we'll start at the 18th century. Not really much is happening at all in terms of disability and education. These two worlds are completely separated from one another. The term disability was not quite used in any similar manner. Individuals with the most significant or severe behaviors or needs were institutionalized for the most part, or kept away from society, hidden in spaces. That is a lot of what we know and used to do and practice within this world. Moving on to the 19th century, it's still not great. But these are our first attempts in the United States to educate others, to create awareness, to create systems for individuals with disabilities. Again, not great, but it's where things gotta move on, started happening bigger picture. 20th century is really where we get our stride, where we start moving. The idea of disability being normalized or being a part of society, a part of something that happens, something that can happen within populations, something that is present within populations, is becoming much more understood and normalized. There are definite attempts to break down some barriers. There are definite attempts to have students with disabilities really included into the education system in a way that's not necessarily just a foot in the door. They have a foot in the door and a seat in the chair. So there's a move happening. Stakeholders who cared about creating education spaces for people with disabilities really were ones that were pushing some of this initiative forward, which is wonderful to know. And we'll look at it in the next slide as well. In present day, or up to present day 21st century, much better, markedly better than any other century before, right? And hopefully we can continue saying that in future centuries as well. But it's still nowhere near perfect disability education. Inclusion is an intensified topic, something that is heavy on the minds of many people, and it's being seen now as a primary directive in a lot of legislation and a lot of funding related things related to disability and education. It's becoming much more, it has to be part of the norm, not that we're trying to make it part of the norm anymore, it just must be. So there's a shift happening. We are nowhere near perfect, and I don't know that perfect is ever a thing that we're striving for, but better is always a possibility. And so that's where we're kind of moving, big picture history of disability education. So special education specifically, there's something to note that there are disability education or disability rights fields and peoples within those fields. And then there's special education as being a practice that happens in a very specific time frame, K-12, right, for students who are in the school system. And sometimes those two worlds do not coincide or collide very well. So for the purposes of the rest of the slide, more possibly the rest of the class, we're really going to be looking at special education within the school system. There are times, obviously, that we will look outside of it, but just know when we refer to special education, there's a difference between special education and, say, disability studies or disability education specifically. And so special education referring first to our K-12, kindergarten to 12th grade plus students. All right, so as a field, as a terminology, as a name, special education happens or only is allowed to happen, or that's not quite right, is able to really get moving because of the civil rights movement. Because the civil rights movement did all, very honestly, just all the hard work to get equal rights for people, at least in paper, then the special education stakeholders and those advocates and all the other people in this world that wanted to create a space and a place and a right for children with disabilities to get taught in schools. This is said, and they wrote on the backs of the civil rights movement and said, well, if all can receive education according to everything that just happened, then the students with disabilities, or SWD as is in the slide, must be included in this process, in this all category. If all means everyone, then everyone has to include individuals with disabilities, children with disabilities. That is the premise of what really got the move started. But because for the most part, it was a really unknown, unheard of, only certain people cared about educating children with disabilities. It had to be fought from a very different side than maybe a social perspective side. It had to be fought from a legislative side. So going to courts, creating laws, advocating, lobbying, these are all things where special education had to do, or had to have a foot in, had to do, had to participate in order to become special education. But because it was predicated on the work of the civil rights movement, you will often see a lot of people who write about a history of special education refer to the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, refer to such strong members in education or people who went through so much in the civil rights movement, like Ruby Bridges, as an example. You will see them cited quite often to say our work in this world that we now call special education could not have happened without the work of all the people who were in the civil rights movement first. And so we have to acknowledge that that's where we started from, and then also acknowledge that it's, unlike other disciplines in the world of education, special education has had to create its own space through legal means. And part of that was citing and looking at the US Constitution, which was in specifically the 14th Amendment, which is that no discrimination. It's tied along with the civil rights one, but in the same sense that saying, well, if you're not discriminating against anyone, then anyone must include individuals with disabilities, and anyone must include individuals with disabilities in schools as well. And so using kind of this own knowledge and power against knowledge and power for all, they really made a push for all to be inclusive of disabilities as well. Because of all this work that was done by these stakeholders, we get our very first law that provided federal money for improving education for students with disabilities. It was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the ESEA of 1965. So 1965 was our first big move. It doesn't feel like a big deal to say, yeah, this law that applies to every kid in the country is going to provide some federal money to students with disabilities. Because federal money was set aside, it sets a precedent for any future law to say, well, you've already said that you, the government, have already said that this is an area of need that requires funding. So the minute that money was provided in any law specific to this issue means that you can make this a bigger issue. You can really put more work and time and efforts into this area, and then make different laws specific to this one's issue. And this issue in this case being special education. So special education then, later on, we get in 5 years later, then 1970, Education of the Handicapped Act. And this is all laws arguably are imperfect, but this is definitely an imperfect law related to educating students with disabilities. But what it does is very important, or the role that it served was very important, because it provided the basic structure, or like the bones of all future special education legislation. Um, it was a kind of a big trial run, essentially, a way to think about it, to say there is a federal law on the books that says that we have to provide students with disabilities education. The reason that I say it's an imperfect law is because there was a lot unknown about disabilities. There's a lot unknown about types of disabilities. There was, and arguably you could say the same thing now, but practices to teach individuals with disabilities, what is required to teach individuals with disabilities. Those were a lot of big unknowns. And this is a time where a law was making it possible for us to find out and to find answers to some of those unknowns, and to create better systems, and to create better, just lots of different things that are better than they were before. But it wasn't quite done yet. So the law became quickly outdated as practices and information was coming in. And which is why only 5 years later after that, did we get PL, or Public Law 94-142, or the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So it was a new iteration of the EHA. But the PL 94-142, you may find a lot of special educators in your lives have this tattooed on them, or know this one by heart, because this is the big one. This is the one that, used the structure of the EHA 1970, made it better, put in all this more information that was found out in such a short amount of time, but also really, really focused on, not only are we now a foot in the door, a seat and a chair in the classroom, we are a foot in the door, a seat in the chair, and a kid in that seat, and a good teacher in front of that classroom, and the services provided. And they are really looking at big picture. What does education mean? Not just what does having a space mean? And again, still lots of ways to make that law better, but PL 94-142, big one for us in special education world. And so over the years, PL 94-142 underwent many changes, and the big ones are 1990, 97, and 2004. The changes were many, but the biggest one is the change in the name to what we now know as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So 1990, 97, and 2004 are iterations of that 94-142. And the law has not been changed since 2004. You will find IDEA to be the big, most dominant thing in special education, because it's the current and only law, and it's been a little over 29 years at this point. And we know it very well now. We've gotten to know this one very specific law very well. And so there's a lot of reasons it has not been touched since 2004. It's most definitely due for a change. I don't know exactly when that's going to be happening. I can take a guess, but there's a lot of reasons why people won't touch this just yet. But when it does, I guarantee you it will be a very, very different looking law, in terms of definitions, and who are students, and who are teachers, and what are all of these amazing things. But we're going to go over it. I want to make sure that you understand first, big important point, IDEA is just it right now in special education. We do not exist. That's arguable. We could exist, but maybe we don't exist as well. Maybe we could have a totally different type of existence in this profession without IDEA, but we really don't get a foothold. We don't have protections. Our students don't have protections. Our families don't have protections to ensure that education is happening for individuals or youth with disabilities without IDEA. We function within this law in public schools, I should mention, so strongly. And so we have to have a very intimate knowledge. IDEA is important, not just in special education world, but to all educators, because you will have a student, regardless of what you teach, or what grade, or what age, or what school you are in. You will have a student, or likely more than one student, who has a disability and is covered through IDEA, meaning that not only is the special educator beholden to that law, so is the school, and so is every single one of that student's teachers. So we all need to be very aware, if we're going to be in the education field, what IDEA is. Before we go straight into the first or the next big bucket of IDEA stuff, I wanted to share some related legislation to special education, or that have meaning to special education. The first being the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. From this act, we get something called the Section 504. We will have a whole class just on Section 504, but it is something that is now included within the IDEA sphere, but is also included within other spheres. It guarantees some rights, but it is also completely misunderstood in the school side. And I say this as someone who I was also still completely like, I don't know, I think this is it, because people don't practice it very well, even though it exists and we need to. But it's a whole thing. I promise we will have a whole lecture just on that one. The next one we have is the American with Disabilities Act, the ADA as we know it, of 1990. Title II specifically has context about education, but really that entire law applies to all of our youth with disabilities, because there is the need to be accommodated. There is the need to have spaces accessible, and that all is guaranteed through ADA. Next, and pretty recently, we have the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or is also known WIOA. WIOA is very specific to our older student population. It's funded through or by, or the money flows through Department of Disability Services, or the Department of Labor, where there's a separate department. Inside of those departments is another department called the Vocational Rehabilitation. There's also, it also has some different names in different states. Everybody does something just slightly different. But essentially what this money does, or what this law does related to schools and students with disabilities, is provide 15% of state funds for vocational rehabilitation, or VR, to go to preparing youth with disabilities for future employment. And so it's very specific to the older students, because that's when they implement or use any of these services. The way this money is used is totally different across states. It's a whole other place to be in. But if you are interested in the world of preparing youth for life after high school, that's something we call transition in special education. Again, whole other lecture we're going to have. But the WIOA is pretty important in that field. And the very last one is the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, of 2015. ESSA is a new iteration of the No Child Left Behind Act. You may remember, or you may just know, that the No Child Left Behind Act was very controversial and pretty punitive on individuals with disabilities, or schools for students with disabilities. Good and bad, pretty controversial law as it goes, but the ESSA is honestly keeps a lot of the same stuff, but also makes it a lot less punitive, a little bit more low-key version of that law. But it does take into account, and does have inclusions for and consequences for students with disabilities and their testing scores and their academic achievement, and the impact that could have on schools and funding and everything. So important, very important. All right. Okay, so we're gonna go into IDEA. As I have listed it there, our guiding light, because as I mentioned, we don't really get to do much in the world of special education in public schools without IDEA. And just a quick note, I mentioned that about public schools because IDEA applies to every single public schools, to public charter schools. It doesn't necessarily apply to private schools in that same manner, but most private schools generally follow IDEA. Because they have to report some stuff, but not all things. Private schools are a little wonky in that way, but and you may think like, well, if not all schools are applicable to it, why do we have to learn it? Because most kids in the United States are taught in public schools. Most kids in the United States are taught in public schools. Most kids with disabilities are taught in public schools. So we are very aware of this, and we keep in mind that we have to know it. All right, so everything from this slide on down comes straight from the IDEA law. It's copy pasted their language in the, I can move this. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm sorry, I can't. In the PowerPoint that is linked in Canvas, if you open it up and you see the notes underneath each slide, there is a link to where the text comes from. But again, this is coming straight from the IDEA law and the sites.ed.gov website, which is where the entire law and resources are housed. All right, so we're going to start with just the very beginning. Where else are we going to go? We have to start with the very beginning, and that is first looking at what is the stated purpose of IDEA. And a question for you to consider. If special education is so intertwined with IDEA, does that mean the purpose of IDEA is also the purpose of special education? That is not something I have an answer to. That is not something I think you will have an answer to by the end of the day. It's something I think about constantly. Just because I don't know if there is a separation. There may be a separation. I would love to hear somebody else's opinion sometimes. If you have one, please share. Okay, so what I've done here is take the 5 purposes, highlighted some of those key phrases, and I'm going to just go over them briefly with you all, but they come up often. All right, so the first one is the first purpose, stated purpose of IDEA, is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. If you tend to read any special education scholarly work, literature, or published papers or peer-reviewed papers, you may often see that they start with, almost entirely start with IDEA says, because if IDEA says it, then we must do it. And if IDEA says that all children with disabilities must have available to them a free, appropriate public education, then we must provide all children with identified disabilities a free, appropriate public education. These words, free, appropriate public education, are also referred to as FAPE, F-A-P-E. And FAPE is a huge, huge issue or huge thing. FAPE cannot be denied to a student with a disability. You cannot deny them a free school to go to, receiving an appropriate education, receiving a public education, so public schools, or education. So there is not a lot of contention about what free and public education mean. There is a lot of back and forth, and historically things are changing about what appropriate education means. And that's an interesting conversation we'll have when we look at laws. Just the whole lecture we have just on laws. We'll look a lot on FAPE. So the other part highlighted in that first statement is that education is not just a place where we send our kids for 12 plus years. It's a place where we send our kids for 12 plus years to prepare for the rest of their lives. Students in schools have a very limited kind of worldview for a while. In general, I'm generalizing here, because they're in school. And for the most part, school is the main thing that they know about life. School has been there for most of the times that they can remember. And it's very hard for them to imagine that they will not be in school for the most part, again, for the rest of, or for the majority of their lives. If they're going to live to be 100, they will only be in school. Say they end after high school, they will only be in school for 18 years, up until their 18 years. The highest would be 21. And that's it. And then you have 60 more years to live as a person, an adult, and not really have to go to school unless you choose to go to school then. Before then, it's not a choice. You have to go to school. And it's very hard for students to conceive a world where they are not in school. They may dream about it. They may think about it. They may have great, wonderful aspirations, but they don't quite understand what that means until after they've left the school system, which means that they are not necessarily looking at how well prepared, or not always, how well prepared they're going to be for pursuing higher education, for pursuing a career or employment or job that they really want, for gaining independent living skills and maybe one day living independently if possible. There's a disconnect between their thinking there. And so we have to know from the school side that that is our purpose. We are preparing our students for the rest of their lives. All right, part 2. This one is it's a very simple one. So states, localities, education service agencies, which are a fancy way to say like region, area, or district area, and federal agencies must provide for education for all students with disabilities. So if you think kind of like hierarchical, big top over looming law is IDEA. It covers the entire United States. From there, every state must implement IDEA, but they can implement it differently. So what happens in North Dakota with IDEA may look just so incredibly different with how special education looks in California. Lots of different reasons to it. The first being population size, the other being regional things, the other being what resources are available. What this is part 2 here is telling us, or number 2 here is telling us, is that they must follow the law. They must have all these other requirements that the law says that must be happening in special education, but the way in which services are delivered, the way in which students are placed, or the names we use to call teachers and all this other stuff, and how we credential teachers and a million things, is left up to the states for the most part. But we have to follow the big federal law. So, all right, part 3, to assist states in the implementation of all of these services for youth. The purpose of IDEA is to assist states in the implementation of all of the services. This one is specifically referring to early intervention services for infants and toddlers. So as you will come to see in the next number of slides, disabilities can happen from birth, can be identified early on, can be identified at really any time in the student's educational process. But for those whose disability is identified early or can be identified early, providing early intervention services is incredibly important. Incredibly important. I cannot stress that enough. It is huge. And so we really need to know that IDEA has contingencies for that. There's a whole sect of the special education and IDEA world that cares a lot about early intervention services. And it's, again, very important, but we're mostly going to be focusing on the K-12 world. So past early intervention, but important. All right, number 4 is to ensure that educators and parents have the necessary tools to improve educational results for children with disabilities through a number of activities. So the first part here is saying educators need to be equipped to teach children with disabilities. Parents need to be able to access and understand this world. And some of these resources and tools that the law is mentioning are coordinated research activities. So things to make education better. We do that through research. We find out what works and doesn't work, which means that there is also funding. This is like a sly way to tell you that funding will be provided to these things. Funding will be provided to do some of this research to make the system better. The next one is personnel preparation. And these are related to money specifically designated to create more teachers and more qualified teachers. So anybody who applied for a grant to be a teacher so that they could be paid for their education, and maybe through their school district, maybe through the state. For example, in the state of California, it's the Golden State Teacher Grant that I'm thinking of first. If you apply and you receive it, they will pay you like $20,000 towards your master's and your credential. And this is part of a personal preparation grant, meaning that you don't have to pay back the money. You have to work in your field for X amount of time, or pay back the money. But so that money is designated to say, we will fund more teachers and we will fund more programs to create teachers. And the teachers are then working in this field, providing these services to these students. And it's all because of this personal preparation line, this very teeny tiny line right here on an IDEA. Big deal. It has funded many, many teachers for many years across the country. Coordinated technical assistance centers. So we'll go over when we look at resources next week. I think we'll go over some of these centers, but essentially it's saying like a whole center can be created just to provide assistance related to IDEA. And that's available to everyone across the country. And IDEA will fund part of or most of that, which is wonderful. Technology, media services, a bunch of other things, very important. All right, and number 5 is to assess and ensure the effectiveness of and efforts to educate children with disabilities. So not only are we saying they must be educated, not only are we saying that states have the ability to decide exactly what that looks like for that state, and not only are we saying that the law will provide assistance and try to create more educators and more supports for educators and families, we are also saying that we have to have a way to look at fidelity of implementation of the law. So is the law being followed? What do we do? How do we assess this? How do we know if it's effective? And then also, how do we know if it's effective in teaching children with disabilities? How do we know if the things that we are currently doing are appropriate, are effective, are helpful to them? There has to be a way for us to assess this. So this little statement here is inclusive of random insurances to check that every state and every district is doing what they're supposed to be doing, but also how do we assess students and know that they are being taught well or taught correctly or not? So those are the purposes of IDEA. The very next part we're going to go into is actually looking into all the disability categories within IDEA. The first thing we need to look at is how IDEA looks at defining children with disabilities. And so a child with a disability per IDEA means a child evaluated in accordance to those numbers. There are very specific parts of the legislation, which is all the next slides, so don't worry, as having any of these listed IDEA category of disabilities. There are 13. And who, by reason thereof, needs special education and related services. So a child with disabilities or a child with a disability, according to IDEA, has to be in one of these 13 categories in order for them to be eligible to receive special education and related services. But it's not just you have to be in one of these categories. There's actually a number of things that happen within those categories, but that's important to know. So what we're going to do is look at each one of these disability categories, and I have them listed out in the slides by alphabetical order. This is literally just exactly how they're listed in the law. So, all right. And again, all of this language straight from the law. The only thing that I have added in some slides is a little asterisk at the bottom. Sometimes, most of the times, that asterisk is telling you that this disability category cannot be solely confirmed through the school. It must be confirmed by a medical professional or an expert in this area. And so that's what that little asterisk is. We are going to start with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Sometimes you may also see it acronized as AUT, but it all refers to autism spectrum disorder. Autism is a developmental disability that it has, according to IDEA, has to have significant impact affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. So generally it's evident before the age of 3, which is why those early intervention services are very important, because students are not yet in school by 3 years old, not usually at least. And so if it's evident before age of 3 and we're able to provide that child and their family services, then by the time they get to school, they don't have to have this lag in services, and they may be more prepared and more successful if they've already been exposed to and given and used to receiving services to help them learn. Autism alone is not a reason for an individual to have a disability diagnosis per IDEA or to receive special education services. A diagnosis of autism within any child has to be significant enough to impact their learning. that without the use of services, and this applies to any disability category, without the use of services, the student will not learn, will not perform well, will not really do well within the school environment. But when given services, then they are able to access the curriculum, education, spaces, so many other things. That is when services are delivered or are deemed, I'm sorry, that is when a student is deemed to have a disability per IDE. So I say that because autism, as in the name ASD, is a spectrum. We can see, or we can find youth or individuals who are at the low end of the spectrum, or I should say at one end of the spectrum, and have very significant and severe needs. They are engaging in stereotyping behaviors. They are a little bit more sensitive to sensory, to noises, repetitive activities. They may have communication needs, and many markers related to autism. And this is what we sometimes most associate with autism. But then you may find an individual who is in the complete other side of the spectrum, or what we call high end of the spectrum. And they are usually the ones that are depicted in TV as having autism as freaky, genius, smart. And that's not always the case. They are just functioning, would be the right word. How they are usually depicted in media is freaky, genius, smart with social issues. But this is the individual who may have markers of autism that are obvious to some, who may also have markers of autism that are not obvious to anybody, but it doesn't mean that they don't have it. This individual, if they are very functioning, very adaptable, able to be within their world without the use of related services or just education services to function and do well in their academic sphere, then they are not likely going to receive services just because they have a diagnosis of autism. That service needs to be given to a student who is not able to access education without them. It's an interesting world. But autism is a spectrum. So a student who is at the high end of the scale, or at the end, and even maybe completely functioning, if they have needs that are significant enough to need services, then they could feasibly get services. It's a whole system. All right, we're going to go into deaf-blindness next. And deaf-blindness, I'm sorry, I should mention this for autism. Autism may be screened in schools, may be heavily suspected in schools. There are definitely tests that we can do in schools, but the diagnosis must be confirmed by a medical professional or somebody who is certified to diagnose autism. You may find a school psych who is trained in this world, or a psychometrician who just does like testing for disabilities in the school sector. It is often easier if a parent has their doctor diagnosed, because then we have medical proof, and that's just a lot easier to take than having to find other routes. And so that's usually the route that's recommended, because if a medical professional tells us, then we got to trust their opinion, because we are education professionals. We live in different worlds. All right, deaf-blindness, again, another one that needs to be confirmed by a medical professional, but also not one that anybody else is trying to usually confirm. Deaf-blindness is concomitant, which also means comorbid, which also means more than one, dually paired. Diagnosis that includes hearing and visual impairment. It's a combination that it's very low populated within the special education world. One of what we would call a low incidence disability, as in we don't see an incidence of deaf-blindness as often as we do autism. And autism used to be a low incidence disability. It's kind of in the middle now. Terms we will go over, I promise. But deaf-blindness is a very unique one in that both are present in the child, but also both are present and have a significant impact in that student's development and that student's ability to function within an academic setting. So deaf-blindness. Then we have just deafness, which is hearing impairment. Deafness can be a scale of hearing impairment, but the important thing to know is that hearing impairment has to be so severe, which is why I bolded those words, that it impacts that student's ability to function within the academic setting. Functioning in the academic setting is really like the key words that we need to know about when just understanding whether or not a child that has a disability is eligible for services. Deafness can have significant impacts on a student's receptive information, their ability, what they're hearing, what they're gaining, if they're only hearing and gaining parts of what is being given or parts of what is being lectured or educated on. There are, as we know, schools devoted to deaf populations for K-12 and also universities and colleges that are geared toward this. And the deaf community is also a very big and vibrant community. And so they function very, again, separately than they do in the world of special education. And so if a student who is deaf is receiving special education services, we must have an understanding that that student's hearing impairment is significant enough for them to be within this setting. What you may often find is that the student is moved to a setting that's a little bit more specialized. Not always, but usually, sometimes, if possible. All right, we have emotional disturbance. You may also see this one referred to as ED, so emotional disturbance, or sometimes EBD as emotional behavior disorder. I don't love the term disorder in terms of and related to this, but it is a commonly used word as well. So emotional disturbance, ED, is a condition that exists over a period of time and is really related in the way that we approach it right now in the academic sphere, the K-12 sphere is related so much to a student's behavior. It's an inability to learn because of something that is causing behavioral issues, and those behavioral issues are tied to that student's emotional disturbance or emotional needs. There are two kinds of types generally that are thought of when we look at ED behaviors or ED students or students with ED, I should say. I apologize. The first being inactive emotional responses, so depression, anxiety, those can be, or mood swings, bipolar disorder sometimes can be so significant for a student that it really affects their ability to learn. And it has really nothing else to do with their intellectual need or other health factors, but emotional. And it can be very, very big. Another marker for an ED disability would be an inability to maintain or build at all any interpersonal relationships with same age peers, with teachers. So when we think of a student who is very combative or very shut down, again, very different types. So the second type would be more of an active behavioral response from students, your students who are acting out, who hit, who get into fights, who bite, who hurt themselves sometimes, whose behaviors are very outward as opposed to students whose behaviors are very inward. This is more often what we know and what we see as for a student with an ED diagnosis through IDEA is those who are exhibiting a lot of those outward behaviors. Often students who have those inactive behaviors, however significant they may be, are not usually likely to become, or far less likely to become diagnosed with an ED disability or receive services for an ED disability because they are internalized. They are not the student causing the chaos and the stress and everything that's happening. That's usually your student with, I'm sorry, that's not usually your student with an ED. That's just who we think of as our student with an ED who has more outside behaviors. Youth or individuals with schizophrenia are also included into the ED world. This term is not at all just for children who are socially maladjusted. We have to remember that there's so much more to do with emotional, right? Like emotion doesn't just mean one emotion, and that emotion being anger. Emotion can have many different places, but and the point being that it impacts a student's ability to learn because there's a lot of other factors happening that need to be addressed first. All right, next we have a hearing impairment. A hearing impairment, again, or like the deafness that I had mentioned before, it's kind of on a scale. We have some individuals who have slight hearing impairment needs and some who have very significant hearing impairment needs. We have friends who have hearing aids. We have friends who have hurt their eardrums for X amount of time because they were in a sports injury. And so this could be a permanent hearing impairment. It could be a fluctuating hearing impairment. It could be a hearing impairment that you've had since birth, or it could be one that's kind of gained in over time because of multitude of reasons. So this one is a little bit different. It is not included in the definition of deafness because deafness is assuming that the student is deaf to the degree that is considered deaf, though that is a whole other kind of sliding scale. All right, next we have an intellectual disability. Intellectual disabilities were formerly referred to as mental retardation. We do not use that word anymore. That is probably the last time you will ever hear me say that word because I don't like it. But the reason we don't use the previous terminology is because of social consequence or social like evolution of the use of the word. I would probably just refer to it as the R word if I have to from now on. So an intellectual disability means significantly sub-average intellectual functioning. Previously, and almost exclusively in the past, IQ tests were used to diagnose or identify an individual with an intellectual disability. However, we have definitely learned that IQ tests are very, very flawed. And because they are so flawed as processes go, we are now looking at other ways to identify an intellectual disability, sometimes coupled with an IQ test to confirm or to provide context or to provide additional proof and support. So, but it refers to a student whose intellectual and cognitive functioning is lower or than their age or grade group expectancy. And we as educators may find this pretty quickly within students, whether or not there's not a specific look an individual has. We may find it very specifically for these students. For students who have significant, and I mean more than students with an intellectual disability may be taught within their general education setting, and that's wonderful if possible and provided as many supports as they need. So you may not know which students have which disabilities within any traditional classroom in school. But if a student's disability in this area is so significant and they are not accessing any of the education that's happening within a traditional general education classroom, regardless of the number of services given in that setting, then they are more likely to be moved to a separated classroom for however long or whatever, however all day long if needed, however is most appropriate to that individual. And then in those classrooms, you will likely find students with significant autism, significant intellectual disability, and other behaviors that are much more high needs than the behavior, or not behaviors, disabilities that are much more high needs than others. So next we have multiple disabilities. Multiple disabilities is a very interesting one in that it is a combination of a student having more than one disability. And of course that can happen where we have a student who's has more than one disability area. And it's not unusual at all to have students with comorbid disabilities or concomitant impairments. You may often find intellectual disability to be coupled with students who have very significant needs. And that just kind of varies, to be honest. But you may also find a student who has a hearing impairment and also has another health impairment, meaning more likely ADHD. We'll go over it next in the next two slides. And those could be completely supported within the general education setting and may not really need too many services, but they'll still be labeled as a student with a multiple disability. And then within these students, paperwork, which we'll go over all that terminology in the coming weeks as well. You will see multiple disabilities being like the primary category. And then when you read a little bit further, you'll find out which are included within that multiple disabilities. More likely they are limited to two. Of course, a student may have more than those two, but likely they are limited, almost always limited to two. In some states, they'll refer to it as a primary and a secondary disability. Sometimes that means that one is more emphasized or more significant than the other, but other times not so much. It just depends, to be perfectly honest, just really depends. All right, so let's move on. We have an orthopedic impairment. Orthopedic impairments, a very interesting one, because sometimes people think that this just refers to like a foot. It's not. It's more thinking of a physical disability that has significant impact on a child's education performance. Again, they all have to have significant impact on the performance. But often you will find that if a student has an orthopedic impairment listed in their IEP, they are more likely to also have multiple disabilities listed as well. Usually because an orthopedic impairment alone is not a reason to receive full special education services. So let's say we have a youth with cerebral palsy who can function in the academic setting just fine, but because of their physical needs, may need access to elevators, may need more time to get to class, may need just different accommodations. Those can be provided through something called the 504 plan, which is, again, something we'll look up in the future. But it doesn't mean that they need full special education services. However, and a different youth who also has cerebral palsy, but has significant impacts to their education, and that must be supported with different or multiple uses of services and supports that need to be in the classroom and in any setting that they are taught in, because that's what they need to learn, then that student would be considered eligible for special education services. It's a very interesting world. Again, another one that we would consider to be low incidence because it doesn't happen or doesn't come across us that often. But because it has a medical diagnosis, we don't tend to find it very rarely. Okay. The next one is an other health impairment, or sometimes or more often you will see it called an OHI, other health impairment. Other health impairments are sometimes referred to as a catch-all category, because when we don't know what somebody's specific need is, or we don't have a name, or we can't really always tell you what that name is, but we know it's not intellectual, and we know it's not like emotional, and it has something to do with the student's health, then we throw into the category of other health impairment. More often than not, students within the OHI sphere have ADD or ADHD, so attention deficit disorder, ADD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. We know these terms in society just very well because it's a very highly diagnosed disability. But just because an individual may have either of these does not mean that they are eligible for special education services, that their needs must be severe enough in this health world for them to have been impacted in their education setting and then require supports to function within their education setting. That is when we provide services. Some other examples of health impairments that are in the OHI category include asthma, diabetes, leukemia, sickle cell, many different things. Just because, again, like I said, a youth has diabetes should not be the thing that stops you from learning. However, your needs in supporting and caring for your diabetes may have significant impacts on your ability to be in the classroom, your ability to function in the classroom. You may require different kinds of accommodations and supports, but those have to all be kind of rolled into one. All right, next we have specific learning disability, or SLD. Specific learning disability is the most common category under IDEA, meaning that the most amount of students who are served in IDEA have this disability diagnosis. It's in 2018-2019 school year, it was around 33% of all students. All students is inclusive of 7 million students across the country who receive special education services. So whatever 33% of 7 million is how many kids have a SLD diagnosis. SLD is another catch-all term to tell us that a student has issues learning, issues being or needs learning, that have not been attributed to health issues, that have not been attributed to intellectual issues, that are not attributed to emotional issues. Those being the other big bucket categories, right? And it's not autism. When you can cross it out, you kind of look other places. However, the students' learning needs are significant enough that we understand that there's something imperfect or imprecise about the way that they are listening, like listening comprehension, thinking or processing information, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or being able to do any math work. So many different reasons why this could happen. The most known and cited within SLD category would be dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, because those are really, I don't know if popular, but well-known terms. So those are the ones we know most, but a student can have none of those and still have issues in any of these areas. The way that SLD is diagnosed is very, this is diagnosed in schools almost exclusively, but the way that it's diagnosed can vary so widely. There's a big push to something, we're going to talk about them in coming weeks, called response to intervention, where in order to diagnose students, where if students are not responding to any type of intervention or supports placed within their setting that are meant to help them learn, and they're not responding and they're still performing poorly in any of the areas of concern, and they continue after numerous attempts to try different things, then we are more likely to find that a student does have an SLD and does require services because they haven't responded to anything that's like supposed to be helping and could feasibly help any other child that's having a hard time in those areas. That's a big one. It's a complicated one. All right, next we have speech language impairment. Sometimes you will see this referred to as just speech language, speech lang, or SLI. And speech language impairment is a communication disorder, as the term speech or language will imply. It can include stuttering, but the stuttering must be significant. It can definitely include impaired articulation, as in a student is, or an individual is trying to communicate and it cannot be understood by others. That would be the articulation part. A language impairment, very similar in the sense that it has to be understood. Voice impairment, a lot of this has to do with however the student is trying to communicate, whatever their intent is, or if they believe themselves to be communicating very well. If no one else, or the majority of people, or the people whom they interact with regularly cannot understand them, then there is something happening. Something wrong, or not wrong, but something that needs to be addressed and something that needs to be supported. A lot of speech language is very interesting. It's not like the most common disability category, but it's not uncommon either. It's somewhere in that middle range. But what you will find is that many students with a disability, regardless of what the disability is, will receive speech language services across the country, because articulation and speech is a big task for anybody and takes a long time. But they may not be diagnosed as having a sole impairment, but they may have needs in speech language. It's a very interesting intersect. The diagnoses for a speech language impairment must come from either a medical professional or a speech language professional. Speech language pathologists they can work within school settings. And at my personal opinion, every single speech language path I've ever worked with is like the best person I've ever worked with as well. And so our world intersects so much. They understand so many of the things we do. And they teach us so many of the things that they do that are pertinent to all of our students. It's a really wonderful field and really great people in general to work with if you're in that setting. Okay, second to last, we have traumatic brain injuries, or TBIs. TBIs are super interesting for lots of different reasons. TBIs are, I don't know if common is the right word, but they are known outside of special education because they can happen to any individual at any point in their lives, which is also kind of scary. So TBIs are traumatic brain injuries that someone incurs, usually through an outside force, like an accident happened or a big the individual was hurt or impacted in some way. And that outside, like that hurt, that accident, that whatever the situation may have been that caused injury to the brain had to be significant enough to change the way the student is accessing or performing in the educational world. So a TBI could include somebody who got in a car crash. It could be a minor car crash and kind of felt their brain jiggle, and it like kind of knocked them for a loop for a while, for a couple weeks. It does not have to be permanent, but it could have significantly impacted that student for a while. However, those are not kind of short-term TBIs or like concussions and things like that are not usually going to be reason enough, or very rarely reason enough to have somebody qualify for services, especially if that's expected to make a recovery from them. But you could have somebody who sustained very significant or maybe multiple TBIs, and that very significant or multiple number of occurrences really, really impacted the way that the individual is learning or processing or functioning. And because of that, then they would be eligible for services. That's the part that's it's case by case almost entirely for this diagnosis area. And it's very, it's very just wide ranging. The ones that we think of the most are sports players who sustain a lot of injuries to the head, like football players, like boxers or UFC fighters. They sustain quite a number of injuries to the head. And as we know, just through popular media, those who do and do not receive services or help from medical professionals for their injuries in this area may have significant long-lasting impact on their speech, on their cognitive functioning, their memory, their attention, their ability to like function and work and move and do all these things that they could previously do and do so well before. Could be significantly impacted. You may also have individuals who have TBI, who have had TBIs from birth or from like early first days of life. It varies so widely. So case by case definitely needs to be confirmed by a medical professional. And our very last disability category is visual impairment, which includes blindness. Visual impairment is, again, kind of sliding scale. But it does not encompass people whose visual impairment only requires the use of like glasses. So a visual impairment, again, has to have a significant impact on the student's educational performance. It could include partial blindness or partial sight, or full, all the way up to full blindness. So again, like I said, just because you are an individual who requires, like myself, glasses or contacts or corrective lenses to see does not mean we are eligible for special education services. Even if before we didn't have those glasses or contacts or lenses, we were not performing well because we couldn't see the board and we could barely see what was happening, and we just recognized the colors of our friends. They're generally blurry colors that we know. That is remedied through the use of those corrective lenses. And because it could be remedied through those use of corrective lenses, you're not eligible for services. However, if the individual has significant visual impairments that even through the use of corrective lenses still has impacts on their ability to function and learn and perform in the educational setting, then they would be eligible for special education services. Again, this is one that we would call a low incidence population. We don't know this. We don't know this to be a high number of students served in special education. Again, does not mean that they don't, but there are also sometimes designated programs in a state or in a district or a large district, usually not small districts, but large districts will have visual impairment programs, or will have visual impairment schools, or just completely different specialized settings, because visual impairments are different to accommodate, just like hearing impairments and deafness are very different to accommodate than would be a student who has a generalized learning disability. So, all right, everybody, those are our 13 categories. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is a big bucket overview. Every single one of these categories deserves so much attention, and we are going to give them all as much attention as we can throughout the semester. But also the legal history of special education is so wide and big, and we need to understand it from many different perspectives. And so it will be a recurring theme throughout the semester. But this was our introductory to this course. I hope it provided you some good background information, and know that we will be only moving on in content from here on out. Thank you all.